I'm speaking with Craig and Cindy Corrie, parents of Rachel Corrie, who was killed by Israeli forces in Rafah in the Gaza Strip in 2003. The Israeli government refused to charge the soldiers who killed her, and the Corries filed a civil suit. Last week they received word that the Israeli Supreme Court had dismissed the suit. They're presently in Olympia, Washington. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi. So you got the court's reasoning through the lawyer? Is that where you heard about the dismissal of the suit?
We were notified at 3 a.m. our time last Thursday that the court had informed our attorneys in Israel that really within the hour they would be publishing the decision. So, we awakened our family members and waited for that decision. And then we were able to speak with one of our attorneys almost immediately after he had had a chance just to skim it. It was a 24-page document, I think, in Hebrew. And so he quickly skimmed it in order to give us the highlights of it so that we wouldn't be learning those or hearing about that in some other way. And then we later were able to have a telephone meeting with all of our family that's been most involved with it. So Craig, Sarah, our daughter, and me, and then to have our attorney Abu Hussein on the line, and to hear more about the details of it.
Now, as I understand, you were suing for damages of $1. Did I get that right?
Well, that was part of it. Actually, there are 3 different levels of damages that you can have in a lawsuit there, and I think here as well. So there's actual out-of-pocket damages, and then there's what I think we call pain and suffering damages, and we were also suing for punitive damages. And we hadn't named the amount of the punitive damages, but in court the judge gave us 5 minutes to come up with an amount, and so we came up with $1 because none of this was about money. It was about trying to get information out about what happened to Rachel, and it was also about accountability for what happened to Rachel. And so the judge was going to cut off our questioning of witness, the person who did the autopsy of Rachel, if we couldn't show how it had some bearing on what might be the outcome of the case, and it was through the punitive damages that would occur. So we set those at $1, and we were allowed to continue to question this witness.
So what would the court... Go ahead.
I would just say, too, that it was our understanding, and our attorneys explained, that as far as damages are concerned in an Israeli lawsuit, that is a whole subsequent act or session of the court that happens after there is a decision, in support of damages. So really the discussion of what would have happened should we have prevailed in the case, that was never really a part of our discussion at any time prior or during the case.
So the court threw it all out anyway. So what was the summary of the reasons they gave in that 20-page document?
I think that it just really boiled down to the idea that under Israeli law, they would not hold their military responsible for anything that they considered to go on in a conflict zone. And they considered Gaza at the time to be a conflict zone. Of course, that flies in the face of international law, but their high court held that Israel is not subject to international law if there is an Israeli law that's passed that contradicts that. So it's really both an appalling and I think an important widespread case. Important case in international law, because they're asserting that without question, whatever happens to, for instance, not just Rachel, but any human rights observer, any citizen of Gaza, any reporter that happens to be there, any UN worker can be killed, and there can be no questioning in Israel about that. And I think that flies in the face of what we think of as a civilized nation. And now you've got the highest court in their land saying, yes, they're outside that law. In other words, they're literally outlaws. And I think the world needs to look at that. And I think the world needs to both sort of offer them a hand to come back inside what we hope is civilized nations, and also give them a push. It's really an outrageous verdict, not just for our family, but for everybody that tries to work in human rights, I think really anywhere in the world.
Now, I think I saw, this isn't just your opinion, but one of the major human rights groups said pretty much the same thing. Was it Human Rights Watch or was it Amnesty?
It was Human Rights Watch that has just in the last day or two issued a very strong statement on the decision and their concern about the message that decision sends, particularly to Israeli military, Israeli soldiers. Sadly, I think we've seen over and over and over again that those soldiers enjoy almost complete immunity to any prosecution or to have what they've done addressed, whether it's in Gaza, in the attacks that we saw in 2008, 2009, in 2012, and now again in 2014, the Mavi Marmara, and everything that's ongoing there. There's just so little accountability for what happens to civilians. And we believe, and I think, I can't speak for Human Rights Watch, but I think that their concern is that when there is conflict, that we've seen the devastation, we've seen the numbers of civilians in 2014 in Gaza, over 500 children killed, and many more, civilians who were not at all engaged in hostilities who were killed there. And a decision like this simply sends a message from the highest court in Israel that soldiers will not be held accountability, and that their commanders will not be held to accountability in situations like this.
Now,
it's an area of conflict.
In your press statement from the foundation, it mentioned that there's a separate suit on the autopsy, and that's going to continue forward. What is that about?
Well, and that's part of what I was talking about when we were talking about that $1. What we learned in court that day from the person, Dr. Yehuda Hiss, who performed the autopsy, there were a couple of things that went on there. For one thing, to go clear back to the time that Rachel was killed, we were informed that to get Rachel's body out of the Middle East, it would have to come through Israel, and Israel would have to do an autopsy before they would release her body. And so we were working with Rachel's congressman, who became our congressman, Congressman Brian Barrett at the time, in his office in D.C., and we said through him that they could perform an autopsy as long as it was not performed by a member of the military, and it had to be done in the presence of somebody from the U.S. Embassy. We then subsequently, I can't remember exactly, but about a year later, we were allowed to read a report from the Israeli military that absolved the military of everything they'd done wrong, but also in there said that the autopsy had been done in the presence of members of the Israeli, of the U.S. Embassy. And then after that, sometime, and now we're talking years, through a Freedom of Information Act, we saw some of the emails that started going back and forth from inside the embassy saying, we didn't have anybody there, did we? And so we were figuring out nobody from the embassy had been there. We also found out that there was a lower court, a magistrate's court order allowing the autopsy, but only if it was done by somebody not in the military and in the presence of somebody from the U.S. Embassy. In court, Yehuda Hiss admitted that there was nobody there from the U.S. Embassy, and he did not go back to the magistrate's court to get a new ruling or anything like that. He said he was a busy man and couldn't be bothered with that. He also then admitted, and this is why we wanted the further questions to be asked, he admitted that he kept, unbeknownst to us, some tissue from Rachel's body. Our memory says that they had tissues from basically every organ of her body, but it's been a long time now. Anyhow, he said that he kept something from Rachel's body, and asked why. He said, well, in case that there was a lawsuit and the Israeli Defense Force might need it. Now, as Rachel's father, there's not one cell of Rachel's body that belongs to the Israeli Defense Forces or Israeli government. And we want to know exactly what they have, and we want to have that repatriated with dignity to her family and her country. And so that request has been allowed to go forward under the Israeli court system. So it's back down in a magistrate's court now, and we'll see what the best way to proceed with that is. But in reality, it just appalls me that it takes, a court action to do what I think any decent person or country would have done a decade ago, more than a decade. It's been almost 12 years.
I would just like to add to that we learned, and it was very disturbing to learn during this process, we learned through the media that Dr. Yehuda Hiss had come under scrutiny in Israel by others, and it's been confirmed that he mishandled body remains of many others, of Palestinians who were killed, also Jewish Israelis who were killed. And I don't want to go into the detail about all the things that happened, but it involved removal of body parts without permission from families. And it was deeply disturbing. It was hard for us to talk about it at the time, but certainly once we learned about this, that provided even more need on our part to find out actually what happened to all of Rachel's remains. And Dr. Yehuda Hiss, it really has become a scandal in Israel, and he was finally removed from his position at Abu Kabir Institute. He had been demoted as a result of all of this for some time, but then finally was removed. And it's a side issue. But it's a very personal issue, and it's very, very troubling that this happened.
I'd say one of the good things that came out of this, we're told, is again anecdotal, but a member of the Israeli media told our daughter Sarah that it was because of what came out in our lawsuit that many Israelis have managed to find out what has been kept by Professor Hiss in the Abu Kabir Institute and get those tissues or body parts or whatever back. And so, it's a ill wind that blows no good, I guess. That it's been very difficult for our family, but at least for some other families, I guess there's some resolution of that part of their loss.
I'd like to switch gears and talk about our government. Our government is supposed to protect its citizens overseas and look out for them, and here Rachel Corrie was doing incredible humanitarian work. And, well, maybe as an interviewer I'm not supposed to say this, but I think our government has been letting down, betraying her and many other Americans who do this kind of thing. But, from what I understand, we've talked before, and they basically said go through the Israeli process, and so you went and waited to see if they would ever file criminal charges, and they didn't, and then you sued in court, and you've gone all the way. How many years has it been in the court system, the civil system?
10 years in the court.
10 years, and so now it's dismissed. Well, is our government going to step up to the plate now?
I'm not sure what our government's going to do, and Craig and I both feel very strongly that there are still outstanding issues. President Bush was promised a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation by Prime Minister Sharon with a report to be given to the U.S. government. And, one of the reasons that we went into the court proceedings was because we have from the State Department confirmation that the report that they read from the Israelis did not reflect an investigation that was thorough, credible, or transparent. And yet they said that there was little more that they felt they could do. And so we were actually encouraged to pursue a legal path. And I think that the question of whether Rachel's case was adequately investigated and the fact that it wasn't, and the fact that now we have gone through this process and the results, while we have had access to the process, which almost no other people harmed by Israel, Palestinians, have the ability to do what we did, or opportunity to do what we did. The outcome basically says that Israel doesn't have to answer for what it did to Rachel in Gaza that day because of it considering it an act of war.
Have you been contacted by the State Department or any other government officials, U.S. federal officials?
Not since the decision has come out. And I think the U.S. should be very concerned because of our, when we give our funding, so much funding to support the Israeli military and government, there are obligations attached to that. That funding is not to be used to harm civilians in war. And there are supposed to be consequences that impact our funding if, in fact, that's the case. And we now have a decision that says that they don't have to have consequences, that they're beyond that according to Israeli law, and that they, as Craig said, are outside of international law. And I think that should be very concerning as we decide what kind of funding should be going to Israel to support their practices.
I want to contrast this with Kayla Miller, who was very unfortunately kidnapped by the ISIS and died under who knows what circumstances. I mean, that's become a huge issue, and I believe the president himself made some kind of statement, but certainly he hasn't in the case of Rachel Corrie.
I think, first of all, we feel a strong connection to the Mueller family, to Kayla Mueller's friends. Kayla spent time in the West Bank. She did some work with ISM and was clearly a young person dedicated to making some difference in a very difficult part of the world. And I thought it was notable that President Obama and John McCain on the floor of the Congress, she's from his district, I understand. I don't know, probably others as well, immediately spoke out very, very strongly on her behalf. My fear, in some ways, is that they were utilizing that as, and what happened to her, as reason to push forward their policies and their goals in terms of what should happen militarily. And I think that it's disappointing that in Rachel's case, when it was Israel that was involved in an act of violence of this nature, that the government was not willing to speak out about the behavior and has not been willing to speak out. I mean, they speak in very general terms about their concern for our family, with condolences to our family, and with concern for civilians. But I think that the contrast between the response in the two cases is noticeable.
Is there any congressman or senator you would say is in your corner who's going to raise this?
Well, you know, we've done a lot of lobbying through the years on this issue, a lot of speaking with people. Our congressman who helped us so much in the beginning and throughout, really, who is a wonderful person who actually then himself made trips to Gaza in 2009. Brian Baird is no longer in the Congress. We certainly have relationship with our local representative. We haven't had time to talk with Congressman Heck yet about the situation. We're still, you know, taking time to let this all settle in and to think about what our next step should be. I'd also like to say that there were in 2003 members of Congress who did step up with us, certainly Congressman Baird, who said in the first day or two after he heard what I wanted to share that Rachel was feeling about the coming Iraq war, he said that we could do a press conference, and he actually arranged that for us in Washington, D.C. And standing with us that day were other congressmen from Washington State, Congressman McDermott, who's still in the House of Representatives, and Congressman Adam Smith, who's also in the House. Adam Smith was previously our daughter Sarah's congressman. The districts have been changed, so that's not the case anymore. But we've continued to be in touch with those offices. We have not yet been in touch with them since this has happened. And again, we just have to take some time to take the next step. It all takes some time to pull things together and think about directions.
My last thing, I don't know if have you seen the CNN poll that said that it started with the tiff about Netanyahu speaking or not speaking to the joint session, and it reported some statistics. But the interesting thing to me is it said it polled, 1,000 people, and it said, do you think the U.S. should be involved in the Palestine-Israel controversy, and if so, on which side? And the majority said we shouldn't be involved. And for people under, and it was 2/3, and for people under 50, it was 70%. I thought that was amazing. I don't know if you had seen anything about that.
I didn't see that part. I think that over the 12 years that we've been working on this, which, for some people we're newcomers, but there's been a very dramatic change in the discourse in the United States, the understanding about what's going on there in the United States, and I think that that's helpful. It's far from getting into the U.S. Congress. I think there are people in both the White House and in the State Department, and probably in the military that understand and agree, or mostly agree with the positions we take, or our understanding what's going on there. I would say that the entire time that we've talked with the State Department, and so that's been under Republican and Democratic regimes, nobody's ever stopped to try to correct us about our understanding. Well, there was one short statement by somebody when I was standing in a hall, but it's not like somebody said, oh, you don't understand all of this stuff. It's in the very early days, we were going to members of Congress, and the State Department knew that. And Congressman Baird, we were in a meeting in the State Department. I came out and I said, I thought they'd probably tell us to stop doing what we're doing. And Congressman Baird said, I don't understand it, but they want you to do exactly what you're doing. And I think they would make the appointments in Congress if they could for us to do it. So anyway, the U.S. population is changing their understanding and their position on this issue, and hopefully our leaders will run around and get to the front of this parade at some point.
Very good. Hey, I want to thank you both for speaking with me about this subject.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity.
I've been speaking with Craig and Cindy Corrie. Thank you all for listening. This is Stan Heller for The Struggle.